So today's topic we're going to talk about is buddy to boss, promotions going from buddy to boss. And in the world of police, fire, EMS, definitely military, and honestly, really any environment where someone's dealing with new relationships and promotions and kind of making that uncomfortable transition to a position of promoted leadership, this is a relevant topic. And in fact, as I mentioned, I get to go around and talk to a lot of police, fire, EMS agencies and workshops. And one of the primaries that we deal with is the difficulty of transitioning from, being a peer to a supervisory role, or a peer into definitely a subordinate and superior relationship. So we're going to cover some of that today. And again, hopefully you guys have some questions. But before we jump into that, we kind of have three different sections we're going to talk about. So I want to kick off with the first one, and it is, why is buddy to boss a challenge? Why is this something that we deal with, and why is it a struggle at times? For those of you that follow us all the time and you know our core values, our laws of combat, the 4 laws of combat, which is what extreme ownership is based on, our number one law of combat is cover and move. And really, this is the core of the issues with going from buddy to boss, because the point of cover and move that we teach and we preach and we live is that cover and move is all about teamwork and building relationships. And the relationship factor of what we're going to talk about, that's a lot of what causes these difficulties, right? So as you go from this position of buddy to boss, these relationships are being forced to go through one of our mindsets, which is innovate and adapt. Undoubtedly, there's going to be some type of change and force on this relationship, and depending upon how strong it is going to depend on how much difficulty you're having here. Now, when we talk about relationships and the importance of relationships, we really discuss that a relationship, I'm going to cliff note this, relationship leads to trust, and trust then gives you the influence over somebody. Now, that influence is what we at Echelon Front truly believe is the core of leadership. It's not rank and title and structure and tenure and all the abbreviations after your name or the brass on your collar. Those things are all important, and those are those promotional things we're going to talk about. But the reality is, leadership, true leadership, is just that ability to influence. Now, when you go through these transitions, when you go through this buddy to boss, and this relationship goes through these tolls and these transitions and all this stuff that's making it difficult, this is where we run into that problem. And realistically, if your relationship's on par, if you're executing on cover and move on a day-to-day basis, and you're executing in the appropriate way, when you get into this buddy to boss transition, you get into this promotion, the ideal situation is that really the only thing that changes is your level of responsibility going to that promotion. And hopefully, if you've been doing these things the right way, your level of influence pretty much stays the same, because you've been putting in the effort and you've been putting forth the work that it takes to build and foster that trust, and therefore the influence. Yeah, your area of responsibilities are going to change, but if you're building those relationships, your influence should remain the same. If anything, go up as you start to perform in this new position. So that's going to be the importance of maintaining these relationships under cover and move, because relationships are important. You want to touch on anything relationships, Rob, before we move on? All right, unmute yourself.
I had this exact situation happen to me on my first deployment to Iraq. I was a young Lance Corporal, which is the 3rd rank in the Marine Corps. And I was in a fire team of 4. And we were basically, the way it worked was we were a squad and we were attached to an entire battalion of infantry. And so each company had their own little section that they were responsible for. So my squad was responsible for this one area, providing support for that infantry company. And they had this small little outpost over here that we would usually just send 2 engineers out to support them. And so it came up that was me and another guy's turn to go out there. And the other guy was my good buddy. He was in my fire team. We'd been training together. We'd been together for about a year and a half now. We were good friends. He outranked me by time and grade by probably a year and a half. He was probably about to pick up corporal, which is the next rank. And they said, but you're going to be in charge of Saunders. And at first I was like, ooh, I don't know what's going to happen. So I went to him and I said, what do you think? Is this going to be cool? And he said, yeah, it's going to be cool. It's going to be fine. And this story is kind of a non-story, because I didn't really do anything. And it all worked out pretty good. I went out there, I was in charge, and we got along fine. We're still friends to this day. And the point that I want to make here that relates to what Danny was just talking about with relationships is you can sort of look at relationships like they are a fire extinguisher, in that a fire extinguisher is a tool that most people they invest in early on, and they kind of hope that they never have to use it. Put it in their trunk of their car, or they put it in the kitchen or whatever, and you hope that you never have to use it. But when an emergency situation comes up, you are extremely thankful that you have that fire extinguisher in that emergency situation. And relationships are the same way. You hope that you never have to rely upon the strength of a relationship to get you out of anything, but something that you want to invest in early, invest in it now, so that when you eventually get to a point where you do have to rely on a relationship for a tough leadership situation, like when you're going buddy to boss, or like when you have a boss that wants to do something that you think is dangerous, or like when you have a weak boss, or whatever the case may be, you're going to run into these leadership challenges eventually. You're going to be so thankful that you had that relationship in place before that leadership challenge came up. So what you want to do is start investing in these relationships right now, as early as you possibly can, so that you have that relationship in place when you need to rely upon it. And one more point with this is that it's not enough just to build the relationship. It's not just enough just to have the fire extinguisher in your car or in your kitchen, wherever the case may be. Good example of this is I had a little leaf fire a couple months ago. I was doing a burn barrel, and a little piece of cardboard flew out and landed in this pile of leaves. And it wasn't a big deal because I had a fire extinguisher right there in my shed. I went over to the shed, got my fire extinguisher, and it didn't work because it was clogged up with mud. So I said, all right, no big deal. I went to my truck. There's one in there. Couldn't find it because it had rolled away from wherever I put it in the truck, 2 years ago when I bought it. So I went to the trunk of my car. I had one in there too. No big deal. So I go in the trunk of my car. That one's empty, even though I never used it. So now I went to all my fire extinguisher places and I don't have one. Luckily, I was able to get a bucket wire. It wasn't that big of a problem, but you can't just build the relationship. You can't just buy the fire extinguisher. You have to maintain both of those things. You have to put time in to maintain them so that, again, when you need them, they're there. And back to you, Danny.
That's a great example. Maintaining those relationships is a key thing. And that's so often we neglect those things, and then we try to go back to that person for help. And it's like, hey, they remember, right? And that's a great transition into this next thing that I want to talk about, which causes a lot of problems with these promotional things, these buddies to boss, the buddy to boss situation. And that is being genuine. I was listening to Sean Glass and Dave Burke on a training recently, and he brought up something that really stuck with me that fits in this category very well. And it was kind of revolved around this being genuine aspect. And so often we see when someone's getting into this new promotional position or preparing to test for this new promotional position, it's like they try to make this 180-degree flip on their characteristics, their intentions, the way they act. And they try to have this whole new personality and this whole new characteristic toolbox that they didn't have prior to this. And that goes for a lot of you guys that are coming through when you're taking on extreme ownership and you're going through this training and you're coming back and you're doing all these things. And we hear a lot, people are like, hey, I'm meeting a lot of resistance because as I come in and I try to implement these new ideas and I try to make these changes, they're telling me, it's like, hey, I remember how you were. And we have this problem with this buddy to boss jumping ratio, because when people come in and they try to make these huge overarching changes, they try to make these huge characteristic changes, people remember, man. People remember what you were like last week. People remember what you were like over the last 6 months. And people remember how you treated them. They remember that relationship that maybe you neglected that Rob just talked about. They remember that you weren't putting in the effort. They remember your good decisions and your bad. And I've talked about this before on a first responder thing. Look, people are watching you. And I'm going to be honest, they're judging you. They're judging you what works. They're judging you what doesn't work. They're judging your responses to things, your emotional responses or lack of emotional responses. And when you come in and you try to make this huge change because you've been promoted, people see that out. And we talk about this at Echelon Front all the time. Jocko talks about this all the time. Look, your intentions have a smell. It has a stench. And people figure this out very quickly. When you come in, you start trying to make these huge overarching changes. And there is a great example that I have of this. I worked at an agency, the agency and the person will remain nameless because I've made that mistake before. Turns out it's large community, but also a very small community, as I see some of you laughing. So I worked with this guy at this agency. And at this particular agency, for those of you that don't know, I started in Northern California due to some family moves. I went to Texas, and then due to some more family deaths and sicknesses and illnesses, I lateraled from Texas to the Idaho area where I'm at currently, and then left and went to go to Echelon Front full time. But so at one of these agencies, this particular agency, we had this seniority list of stepping up and either riding, doing engineer stuff, or riding the seat. And for those of you guys that are not in fire, basically that means stepping up or riding the captain's position or lieutenant's position on the apparatus for the day, be in charge of everything that's happening. And this one particular guy, he was that person. He had terrible relationships. He was the one that always disappeared when the dishes were happening. He was never participating in kind of the day-to-day work stuff. He had kind of poor communications and ability to execute on calls. But the way this SOP and this policy was set up was, it was seniority based. So whoever was there, and if they needed someone to step up into this position of leadership, they would step up and ride the seat. And he would be it a lot of times because he had been there quite a while. But as soon as he would step up into this seat, he would step up into this position, it's like he flipped a switch and he was a totally different person. And he would start to give us all these lists to execute on, all these tasks. He'd be like, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. And he started with this whole rah mentality of trying to foster all these relationships. But the problem was, like I said, I remembered the first 24 hours of the shift when you weren't riding the seat. I remembered when you ditched out on everybody and you didn't put in the effort. I remember when you treated us bad. And it's like, you're not going to get the support of these people when you're not being genuine and you're not being that person ahead of time to include building those relationships. That's going to cause you a lot of problems with this buddy to boss ratio. Not to mention another agency I worked at, after that one, my most recent one, there was a peer review process in the promotional. So if you wanted to actually test to go to the officer level position, so for the police side, it's like you'd be getting into either your sergeant, lieutenants, and higher. This was for lieutenant or house captain on the fire side. There's a full peer review section, and we would have guys and gals go through the promotional aspect, knock it out of the park, knock out the testing, knock out the teaching portions, knock out all of the stuff, the scenario-based stuff. And then the peer reviews would come out to every person in the agency, and they would get annihilated on the peer reviews. And they would go from number 1 or number 2 in point sections to number 15 of 15 on the list, simply because of the peer reviews, because it was disingenuine when they came in and tried to make all these huge changes, right? So I'm here to tell you right now, leadership starts right now. Leadership starts right now in the position that you're in. Leadership doesn't start, or your need to step in to be a leader, or your need to step into these positions doesn't start when you get to the next level. And so often we lie to ourselves and say, well, hey, I'm not in this position right now. I will worry about getting into that position of leadership. I will worry about taking on those things when I elevate to the next level. And the bottom line is, leadership starts now, because if you wait too long, it's an uphill battle and you're destined for failure. Rob, you got anything on this?
Yeah, just to add on to what you're saying about people remember who you were last week when you weren't a lieutenant, you weren't a captain, you weren't in this leadership position. People also remember, what you know. They know your level of experience, right? So one of the things that we need to make sure we're not afraid of when we enter into this leadership role is what a lot of us are afraid of, is saying, I don't know. You have to admit that you don't know some things, because, hey, look, everybody's going to know what you don't know already, because these are your friends. And when you try and make something up, even though you know that you don't know, and they know that you don't know, and they see you kind of struggling to try and make something up that you obviously don't know, you're going to lose respect that way. And again, your intent has a smell. So don't be afraid to say, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely power in that. And that's a perfect transition transition into this next section of egos. We all know that egos are a problem. We talk here a lot at Echelon Front about checking your ego, about subordinating your ego. And anybody here at Echelon Front, I don't care if it's a cadre Black Polo, I don't care if it's our operations managers and staff and support staff and media, and anyone that works with us will tell you that the most important characteristic of a good leader is humility. And the most important thing about humility is being able to check that ego and being able to detach from your emotions and detach from all these things and be able to see them for what they are. Now, in this particular scenario, there's two different egos, sometimes more, but there's two aspects of ego that we need to talk about here. And there's the subordinate's ego, and then there's the superior's ego at this point. Now, in the superior's ego, getting into this new position, so you've made it through all these other hurdles, you've made it through the relationships, you've made it through the innovate and adapt on the relationship and the changes and that turmoil. You've been genuine for, the last year, 2 years, people remember those things. They remember you from the academies, all of that. Then you've put in the work. And now you get to this position where you're stepping into this new leadership role. You're definitely taking on more responsibilities. You're definitely putting more on your shoulders. And our ego gets involved. And there's a section in leadership strategy and tactics. In fact, there's a whole section in leadership strategy and tactics that talks about this, from going from peer to leader and so on and so forth. And if you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. And one of the things it talks about is that you can't let these promotions go to your head. And a lot of the times when we let it go to our head, we let ourselves fall into this, disease of victory, and this ego starts to get attached. We feel like we want to make these huge overarching changes. We want to make our mark on the unit. We want to make our mark on the battalion. We want to make our mark on the patrol. And we really want to make a name for ourselves. And one of the things it talks about in there is that, generally speaking, extreme changes, extreme actions, and coming into a new environment, a new unit, a new team, even if you know that have been working with them for a while, extreme changes are generally not a good thing. And to keep yourself from kind of getting into that inflated ego and into that headspace, you have to remind yourself. In fact, Chief Shy, I just saw you put it in here about being humble. And I have written down almost exactly what you said. You have to stay humble and be humble and check that ego. And you do that by asking questions. When you're the new person on the team, now you might be changing shifts, battalions, patrols, whatever. But when you're the new leader on the team, the first thing you want to do is realize that all the people that you're getting ready to work with, all the people that may be your subordinates, and definitely the people that are your peers, equals, and superiors, they're all assets for you. They all have different experiences. They're all great at different things. They all have things that inevitably they're probably better at than you, for sure, in some aspects. But as a new leader, a lot of times we come in and we want to show that we're the iron fist and show that we're going to make the mark. But look, here's the deal. You got to ask questions. You got to utilize your team's talents. You got to get buy-in from your team. And you don't get buy-in from your team by coming in and saying that everything you guys have been doing, I'm wiping off the table. This is my team now in my way, and I'm going to make a mark. Because you will make a mark and you will make a legacy, and it's not going to be the one that you want. And it's most likely probably not going to be positive, right? So there's ways to do this. Like I said, you ask questions, figure out who has ownership of certain things and who's doing well. Review personnel files, review, the wars that they've been rewards, review their job reviews and personnel reviews and all that type of stuff. Figure out who they are, figure out what makes them tick, and then be humble enough to ask them questions. Come in and say, hey, look, you've been running this area of the program. You have a better understanding of this. There's no need for me to take this away from you. How about you fill me in and you keep ownership of it? When we let our egos get in the way and we check in and feel like we have to come in, we just become the tyrant. And that is a huge buddy to boss problem when you come in and you become that tyrant. That is not the effect that you want to take. Now, the other side of ego on this is not the superior, it's the subordinate side. And this is where we definitely deal with some challenges. And I've dealt with this personally after getting some positions that other, guys or gals didn't, especially because I've lateraled a few times, and some of those positions that I've been put in, because of my lateral experience, I just happen to have more experience in some areas, whether it be popping into FTO positions or whatever, above people that have been at that department longer than I've been there, but have less time in the field. And that's when these egos get involved on the subordinate side, and they start thinking one of maybe a few things. Maybe they feel like they deserve that promotion, right? Maybe they feel like they were passed over unrightfully. And here's the big one. Maybe they don't think that you deserve it. And that could be for a multitude of reasons. But the way to approach this is not to try to smash that person or try to be like, hey, you don't know enough about me, or get defensive, because now we're letting that ego get in, right? You have to come at this from a place of one of our mindsets, right? Which is extreme ownership. It's the name of the game. It's the name of the book. It's what, the boss man wrote about. And from a place of ownership, if someone's saying, hey, I feel like I'm more qualified than you, or I feel like you don't deserve this promotion, or I feel like you're not the right person for the job, you have to come from a place of ownership and ask yourself this difficult question and check your ego again, which is there any validity to what they're saying? Because a lot of the times we don't want to acknowledge the things, these complaints and the things that they have for us, but you got to ask yourself, hey, what did I do? What did I put out there that made them feel this way? Why do they feel like I'm not qualified? Why do they feel like I don't have the leadership capabilities to do these things? Why do they feel like, they were passed over unfairly? And the chances are, if you pull that thread deep enough, you're going to be able to find something that you've done, a way that you treated them, a way you dismissed them, a way you kind of came in too strong or too hard on that tyrant side, like we talked about, that led them down this path to feel this way. And that's a huge hurdle for the buddy to boss relationship. You got anything on that, Rob?
Yeah, I wrote down this one little note here. I think it's important to remember with this, when we know about both of those types of egos, the follower ego and the leader ego, we're going to be aware of both of those regardless of which position that we're in. So if you've just become a leader, you're going to be aware of the follower egos. And so what we have to be wary of here is being in the position where we're going, oh, he's using or she's using, she has the follower ego. That's what this is. Or if you're in that follower position, you're like, oh, he's got the leader ego. That's what it is. What we're still talking about here, we're talking about your ego. Your ego is going to be the one that gets in the way. And their ego is only ever a problem if your ego isn't in check. That's it.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah, and that's why, like Chief Shy wrote on here, be humble, treat people with respect, listen to others, implement their ideas, don't forget where you came from. I couldn't sum it up better than myself, Chief. That's amazing.